Welcome to this week's Short Clip Friday podcast. On Fridays, I will be posting clips from previous episodes, and the point here is just to bring you some of the highest yield topics from each podcast in order to kind of reinforce those topics. This clip covers SDS Page and is from the Separation and Purification Techniques podcast. Enjoy. All right, so this next segment is going to be about protein-based separation and purification techniques. And so the way I kind of want you to think about this is I want you to think about the differences between proteins. What are these differences that we can then exploit to separate, isolate, purify proteins? So there's a few different exploitable characteristics of proteins. That is their size, their shape, their net charge, their hydrophobicity, and also their affinity to other molecules. So those are kind of just the basic factors that we are going to use in all of these different techniques to either purify, separate, or isolate a specific protein. So the first thing I'm going to get into is SDS Page. So SDS stands for sodium dodecyl sulfate, which is a detergent that essentially denatures proteins and makes them unfold so they become these linear protein chains. Imagine taking like a wadded up piece of paper, unfolding it into a flat piece of paper. That's basically how this detergent works. And then Page stands for polyacrylamide gel electrophoresis, which is the part of this process in which you run this protein through a gel that separates the different molecules of protein based on their size. And so SDS Page then is a method that separates proteins based on their mass or their molecular weight. And let me quickly mention why SDS is so important. So if you don't unfold these proteins, then when you run a protein through a gel, right, let's say you have a mixture, you're going to have proteins that, form these perfectly spherical balls, and then maybe some that are more elongated, etc. And so those are going to travel at different rates through this gel based on their shape. So what SDS Page does is it essentially gets rid of that variable. It gets rid of the shape variable because it just unfolds these proteins into these long linear chains. And then that way you can separate them perfectly by their molecular weight or mass. So SDS Page gets rid of the shape variable. Another really important thing SDS Page does is that it gets rid of the charge variable of proteins as well. So in a gel, you apply an electric current to this gel, and what happens is that causes these charged proteins to move through the gel. Well, if you go back to my physics electromagnetism podcast, you'll remember that the more charged a particle is, the greater the force it experiences in an electric field. So if you had two proteins and they're the same size, but one was more charged than the other, then in a gel, the one that was more charged would actually travel further down the gel. So what SDS Page does is essentially ensures that each protein has the same negative charge. So this is all to say that SDS functions to remove two variables out of separating these proteins. That is the protein's charge and the protein's shape. So again, once these proteins are unfolded by this SDS, you place them in this polyacrylamide gel, and what happens is these smaller proteins move further through the gel. They move further down through this gel, and the bigger proteins don't move as far. And so what happens then is you get this separation of these proteins based on their molecular weight. And so you get distinct bands on the gel, and if you've ever seen any kind of gels that have been run, on DNA or proteins or anything like that in a lab setting, you'll know what I'm talking about, but you get these distinct bands on a gel that correspond to some molecular weight. And if you've never seen this before, I recommend you just go look it up, kind of see what I'm talking about. But usually how this works is you'll have a ladder that's run on the gel, and a ladder is just a set of proteins that have known molecular weights. And so when you run them, you get a bunch of different bands and you know exactly the molecular weight spread of these proteins. So then what you can do is you can run your protein or your mixture of proteins alongside of it. And then from using that ladder, you can estimate the molecular weight of the proteins that you ran through this gel. And so that's the basic principle through which this SDS page works. What I think is more important for the MCAT is understanding the difference between three different types of page. You have reducing SDS page, non-reducing SDS page, and native page. And this is really where I've seen it come up on the MCAT. So if you haven't been paying attention so far, pay attention to this part. So non-reducing SDS page is exactly what I just talked about. You separate proteins based upon their molecular weight. You throw in this SDS, which is detergent, which unfolds the proteins. Then you throw them onto this gel, and then you get bands depending on the molecular weight of these proteins. On the other hand, reducing SDS page uses a reducing agent to break disulfide bridges between protein subunits. In other words, this pulls apart protein subunits and then unfolds them and then runs them on a gel. So in this case, you are able to look at the size of protein subunits and elucidate whether or not a protein may have subunits or it may not have subunits, right? If you were to have a single protein and then run a reducing SDS page and you saw the same exact band pattern as you did for a non-reducing SDS page, well, then you would know that this protein is probably not made up of subunits. And the last page I want to talk about here is native page. And this can also be abbreviated as CN-page, just so you know. And essentially, this type of page does not use detergent, which is why you leave out the SDS part. And instead, it separates protein based on the three factors that I was talking about that SDS gets rid of. So it separates proteins based on their size, their charge, and also their shape or their conformation. And at this point, you might be thinking, okay, why the hell would I want to do that? Right? You're separating proteins based on three variables together. It's just really confusing. Like, what do you actually get out of running a native page? Well, one place this comes in handy is when you're looking at protein aggregation states. When you don't use SDS, you essentially keep protein aggregates intact, right? You don't break up these aggregates. And so one way to look then at protein aggregation is to run a native page and to see if you get these big kind of high molecular weight bands that come from protein aggregation. So one function of native page is to look at protein aggregation states. So let me just give you a real quick summary of what I just said. So reducing SDS page uses a reducing agent to break disulfide bonds, which then breaks up protein subunits. And so then you're essentially separating proteins by their subunit and then by their molecular weight. And then non-reducing page, you do not use a reducing agent, so you don't break up a protein in terms of its subunits. You just keep all the subunits together, then separate proteins by their molecular weight. Native page does not use any type of detergent, so you are separating proteins based on their size, their charge, and their shape.
At Med School Coach, we know that getting into medical school is hard. In fact, 60% of pre-meds who apply to medical school don't even get accepted. And if you want to get accepted into a top medical school, it's even harder. It's a complicated process, and even students with great grades and MCAT scores get left out. That's why more students than ever are turning to Med School Coach for admissions advising. Our advisors are all physicians and former admissions committee members, so they know exactly what medical schools are looking for. One-on-one admissions advising from Med School Coach makes all the difference. Our expert team will help you develop a game plan, prepare your application, edit your essays, and coach you for interviews. Every pre-med has a story, and we'll help you tell it so you can stand out from the crowd. Visit us online at medschoolcoach.com and use offer code PODCAST10 to save 10% up to $400 on a Med School Coach admissions advising package. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and Med School Coach can help.